Good afternoon, and welcome. Welcome to San Francisco. My name is Lisa Villareal, and I am here during this lunch period representing not only the Coalition for Community Schools as Vice Chair, but also President and CEO of the San Francisco Foundation, Sandra Hernandez, who could not join us to introduce her wonderful colleague, the Mayor of San Francisco. So let me tell you a little bit about our mayor, and let me tell you a little bit about the passion that he has for community schools. Rarely do we find an elected official, a mayor, who comes with so many vital skills and experiences that relate directly to powerful community engagement. From his early days as managing attorney for San Francisco Asian Law Caucus, to key city positions including Director of Employment Relations, Director of the Human Rights Commission, the Director of City Purchasing, Director for Public Works Department, and finally, as City Administrator prior to his election, Mayor Edwin Lee has experienced every civic perspective for effective community engagement with schools. His dedication and passion for children and youth are evidenced by his extraordinary support for the San Francisco Department of Children, Youth, and Families, one of the first national city-based initiatives to support children and youth, to be matched only by his outstanding partnership with San Francisco Unified School District, which is one that many schools and many districts across the United States would envy. Together, they have forged a partnership to deepen community engagement in schools and have embraced a full-service community schools initiative across the city of San Francisco. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our 43rd mayor, and I might add, our first Asian American mayor of the city and county of San Francisco, Edwin M. Lee.
Well, thank you, Lisa, for that introduction, and welcome everybody to San Francisco. How do you like the weather? Well, as Lisa had a chance to mention, first of all, I want to thank her and Marty Blank from the San Francisco Foundation and Sandra Hernandez, who isn't with us today, but they're all doing such a fantastic job in working with our school district and our school educators to make sure that our school district is never isolated. I learned that a long time ago, that the best cities are the ones that place education in the very center of what we're trying to do as mayors. I want to welcome, thank you, I want to welcome the mayors of Lincoln, Nebraska, and Hartford, Connecticut here. Thank you for being here. I want to welcome all of the various school board members, the school administrators that are here today on this important topic of community schools. Thank you for coming to San Francisco. Thank you for interchanging and taking this opportunity to learn from each other how we can even do better. You know, I was talking with my education advisor, Hydra Mendoza, who's on our school board, who works right in my administration. And it doesn't go for a week that we don't talk to each other about the value of education. Whether it's her, whether it's Carlos Garcia, or now incoming director or superintendent of our school district, Richard Carranza, we're going to always place education at the center of our agendas. That's what we have to do. I can't conceive of any city in the country who wouldn't place education to the highest part of their agenda. It just doesn't seem like you're a city if you don't do that. And in San Francisco, we value that because we are knowledgeable and we know how important it is, not only for our kids, but the role of education in everything that we do, and the fact that our community school concept is alive and well in our city. We know, and we've had those years. We've had those years where we looked at the school district and we said, well, wait a minute, we don't have to kind of work with them. They're a state agency. and then the state gave it up. And they keep giving it up. And we keep having to respond. Well, for me, I'm kind of sick and tired of responding to what state's not going to do, that we have to anticipate the bad news, and we have to embrace our school districts. We have to make sure they're always a part of our city. That's why we've been working on ideas and programs to make sure our health department is engaged with our school district. Our public safety agencies are engaged with our school district. Our mayor's office, our budget office, our board of supervisors, all the other elected officials have to find some way to engage our school district, their administrators. That's why I've been talking all morning with Hydra too about how can I get a meeting with our CEOs and CEOs. Yes, our principals of our school districts. They're kind of like our CEOs. We've got to engage everybody to make sure we're doing all the right things and balancing all the things that they need to run a successful school property and a school program. I benefited from public education many years ago. In fact, now that I'm 60, those years are being recollected slower. But as a recipient of public education, I know for so many years that I was passionate about making sure I succeeded as an individual. So I sought ways to succeed. There are more barriers to success these days, financial barriers. Every time we turn around, there is another barrier presented to successful education. And that's why the cities must be involved. That's why community education and community schools have to be a concept that everybody embraces. So I want to thank you for holding this important meeting here, because we have been trying to champion the whole community schools concept. We know that success of our kids has to do with everybody being involved. You know, from Arnie Duncan to Carlos Garcia to everyone who's been involved in this movement, we know that a success of our kids will have to involve everybody and have to involve it at an early stage. We can't let our schools fail by allowing them to be isolated. And so with your help, with your ideas, with the programs that our foundations are coordinating and implementing, the greater ideas to involve everyone else in the community with our schools, that's going to be, I think, the way out. The other thing I'd like to make sure you know, too, is that I think one of the newer efforts that are going on is really to involve more of our businesses with our schools. In San Francisco, we are leading the effort to make sure our technology companies innovate and find their success as part of our city. I would like that sense of innovation that many of our technology companies are bringing to their businesses to also happen with our school districts. I know that if we can innovate our way to better taxi dispatches, as we are doing with our technology companies, or better ways of service delivery, we can also innovate ways in which education can be a greater part of every kid's lives and all of the parents, and making sure we can use technology and the business community to do that. So we're going to be introducing these ideas, working with our principals, working with our school boards and our superintendent to make sure that we can also link our newest businesses that are doing great things and discovering fantastic ideas of businesses. We can also link them to our school districts and make them an innovative part. Thank you for being here in San Francisco. Thank you for sharing, and thank you for just being part of a great movement of community schools in our city and in our country. Thank you very much.
It's my pleasure and my privilege to introduce a friend and colleague who has been the shortest learning curve on full-service community schools that I could possibly wish for. And I'm talking about Georgette Bhathena from the JPMorgan Chase Foundation. Her office is based here in San Francisco. And I wanted to just take a moment to acknowledge the commitment and the resources that Chase has brought to the full-service community schools movement, not just in the Bay Area, but across the United States. So here to kick off the panel And to kick off, the next moderator is my friend and partner, Georgette Bhathena.
Thank you, Lisa. At JPMorgan Chase, our goal is simple, and we strive to be a catalyst for meaningful, sustainable change in the communities where we operate. And supporting education is a fundamental pillar of this approach. As part of our education strategy, we invest in community schools since they serve as important hubs that bring together partners that offer a range of supports and opportunities to children, youth, families, and communities. And in the 21st century, we need to find ways to be equitable while recognizing each student's path to equity will be different. Equity doesn't mean providing the same things for all students. And we need to ask the question, how do we provide access to critical resources like a quality education and social and health services to ensure equitable educational outcomes and achievement? In addition, education is key to fueling the workforce. For a country to grow and prosper, we will need everyone to be primed and educated for those opportunities. As cited in the Pathways to Prosperity project, within the U.S. economy, there is growing evidence of a skills gap in which many young adults lack the skills needed for many jobs that pay a middle-class wage. And over the past third of a century, all of the net job growth in America has been generated by positions that require at least some post-secondary education. Workers with at least some college have ballooned to almost 60% of the workforce from just 28% in the early 1970s. And as you've probably heard this statistic, the lifetime earnings gap between those with a college degree and those with not a college degree is estimated to be nearly $1 million, and the differential has been widening. So now, more than ever, as the opportunity to divide widens, it's important to invest equitably, not only because it's the right thing to do, but it is also an economic imperative. At JPMorgan Chase, we're very proud to be a sponsor of the forum this year, and we appreciate the healthy dialogue and discussion around these critical issues facing our community. With that, now I'd like to introduce Jane Quinn, who I know needs no introduction with this crowd and who spoke last evening from the National Center for Community Schools and the Children's Aid Society. Thank you.
So I am not Jane Quinn. She's standing right next to me, but I have to make an urgent announcement.
Please.
And that is that all site visits need to check in upstairs at the atrium at 1 p.m. with the exception of the Balboa site visit. And now, my friend and partner, Jane Quinn.
Thank you. Thanks, Lisa. Well, I think you've looked in your program and you know what the topic of this plenary session is. And what could be a more fitting or important topic for today's luncheon plenary than the topic of equity? I believe that most, if not all of us in the community schools work are here because of our commitment to equity. Last night I had a chance to talk a little bit about Joy Dreyfus, and I just want to tell you one other thing about our godmother guru. She used to say, "I'm an activist masquerading as a researcher." And by that, she meant, I think, I am in this because it's about social change. I am in this work. I am devoting years of my life to studying and documenting the work of community schools because it is about equity, it is about fairness, it is about social change. And I think that's why we're all here. We're coming from 36 states and about 100 communities, and I know that in our own communities, we see every day the inequities that exist between poor children and more affluent children, between children of color and white children. And we're troubled by that. We understand, because we've looked at national and local data, just how many disparities there are and how long-standing many of these disparities have been there, and we are moved to take action. Today's plenary session is not a call to a commitment to equity because we're already there. It is about helping us think about how our work in community schools relates to a broader equity agenda across America. It's really designed, and we've had several planning conversations to really think about how to make this a useful session as we talk to the choir about equity, but we've designed this session so that we're really thinking about how the work of community schools connects to the broader equity agenda across America, how education work relates to a number of other important issues in our communities, issues like job creation, health care, transportation, and housing. I can think of no better person to spur our thinking on these issues than the woman you are about to meet. It is a great honor for me to have the opportunity to introduce you to Angela Glover Blackwell, someone whose work I have admired for a long time. I am tempted to say that she needs no introduction to this audience of change agents, because I know that her accomplishments and her commitments are known to social justice advocates all across this country and internationally. But just in case you don't know, Angela is the founder and CEO of PolicyLink, an organization that since 1999 has advanced social and economic equity by bringing the wisdom, voice, and experience of low-income people of color into policy-making processes. Since Angela's more extensive biography is available in the conference program, I will not say anything more about her impressive background. It's my job here to let her speak for herself, something I am more than happy to do. Angela?
Well, good afternoon. I'm delighted to be here and so excited about the work you're doing. And I am indeed speaking to the choir when I talk about equity to this group. And I'm happy to do so because those of us who are in the choir can do a much better job of coordinating our work, lifting up each other's work, understanding that we're part of something much larger than the work we're doing. We in the choir have to understand how important the work is that we're doing now and how to be leaders in the equity movement to build a fully inclusive society. Those of you who have heard me speak before have probably heard me talk about growing up in St. Louis, Missouri, and I want to talk about that now for a little bit. That is where I spent my formative years, and it's interesting to me how often I refer back to it and how often I think about it. Because the truth of the matter is I haven't lived in St. Louis since I was 17 years old and went away to college. But what happens in elementary school, in high school, in the community, in the churches and faith institutions where we really are formed as people does guide us, does set a framework for us as we go forward. Many things about my growing up in St. Louis in the 1950s and early 60s in a segregated St. Louis, Missouri, have helped me to understand things that I don't think I would understand as well if I hadn't had that experience. One of those things is the value of community and the gift to be surrounded by caring adults, in my case, who spent 24 hours a day making sure that the children who they had responsibility for and who they felt they had responsibility for were protected from the sting and burn of racism. Everything that I did was in the black community. We lived in the black community. I went to school in all black schools, prayed in all black churches, volunteered in all black communities. And the schools really stand out for me because all of the things that I was interested in other than school happened at school. Even the things I wasn't interested in happened at school. Like all of my polio vaccines were at school. I remember standing in the hall waiting for my turn, but it's where I learned to dance. It's where I got a chance to practice oratory skills in addition to being at church. It's where I learned teamwork. It's where I got a taste of drama. And I got all of it from the most incredible adults who were in and out of the school building. One of the things about segregated schools that was quite a gift to the children who went to them in places where separate but equal really was operating. You know, when you think back before Brown versus Board of Education, there were several segregated systems in the country. One was separate and nowhere near equal, and that was often in rural areas of Mississippi and the southern part of the United States, but in places like St. Louis and Chicago and Philadelphia, you actually had a good number of schools that had the same physical facilities, had extraordinary teachers, had extraordinary curriculum. I went to one of those schools. I went to a couple of those schools. But my high school I wanted to talk about for just a second, where we had the most extraordinary teachers, because the teachers that we had, many of them could have done anything in the world if it had not been for racial discrimination. I had an extraordinary literature teacher who had a PhD in literature from Columbia University. He taught in my high school, and to this day is one of the most literate people I've ever come in contact with. I had a Spanish teacher who was very fluent in Spanish and went to a Spanish-speaking country every summer and brought us back all kinds of things. I had a journalism teacher who was the editor of the African American newspaper. And so it was amazing what we had. And it's amazing what came out of Sumner as you had this concentration. One of the things we had there was one of the most renowned tennis coaches in the black community nationwide. Arthur Ashe left Virginia to come to Sumner High School to study under Mr. Hutchins and went on to be the Arthur Ashe that you all know. Ken Billups was one of the most extraordinary music professionals in the country. Grace Bumbry came out of his tutelage, as did Harold Wheeler. I know you know the name of Grace Bumbry. You might not know Harold Wheeler, but you certainly know his work. He was the first African American and the youngest to be the head of the orchestra on Broadway. He did Promises, Promises. He is the person you see in the orchestra with Dancing with the Stars. He's done the Academy Awards on many occasions. I remember when we used to just sit in the auditorium and just watch Harold Wheeler conduct. It's the high school that I went to. It was amazing. It was all day. It was into the evening. It was constant. It is what you do. It's what you bring back. I had the extraordinary experience just last week being in Chicago and going to the Finger High School in Chicago in the Roseland community. It reminded me so much of Sumner High School, where I went in St. Louis, Missouri. It was an old building. It had that same character, but it reminded me of it on the inside, too. It reminded me because it was beautifully maintained on the inside. It was orderly. There were sections for young people to work on, learning to build things and do electrical work. There was a section where people were learning culinary skills. And the thing that really reminded me of my high school was that when we arrived, there was a beautiful mural that the young people had done dedicated to peace. And it had that same feel of ownership and belonging that I remembered from Sumner High School. There were some children who were sitting in the hall, and they were sitting in a circle, and they were reading. And there was a sign that said, "Sit in." And I thought, uh-oh, is there something going on here that we should be concerned about? Are the students protesting? But it turned out they were sitting in for reading. They were sitting in for reading. They were reading about the sit-ins during the civil rights period, and then they were going to talk about it. Just extraordinary. All these things that I was seeing happening in this school and the things I was hearing about because they were community school, because they had a coordinator who was actually working to make sure that children could reach their full potential, could find all of those ways to reach beyond the classroom and understand what inspired them. It was so refreshing to see that we actually can reach back into our past, pull forward the best from it, and begin to help children understand and think of schools as community schools. Congratulations for your work, because you really are at the cutting edge of helping children even aspire to reach their full potential by having ways to understand what that means. But your work is important beyond that. You are part of what will allow children to really reach their full potential. And we need for children to reach their full potential. We need it. We need it more than we ever have. We're operating at a time in which we have come to realize as a nation that we're at a crossroads. We're at a crossroads. It's an exciting time to be in the work world. It's an exciting time to be an adult. It's an exciting time to be a change agent because things could go in multiple directions. Which direction will be determined by the noise we make, the data we bring forward, the actions we take, the results we produce, the policies we change, the people we elect. It'll be determined by what we do as adults to say, here's the future that we want and here are all the ways to achieve it. What we know is that we're coming out of an economic crisis. We're coming out of an economic crisis. We're recovering slowly, but I think most of us in our hearts know we can't recover to what we were before. Whatever we recover to this time has to be real, it has to be based on a solid foundation, and it has to be inclusive. We're coming out of a time where the prosperity that we thought we were experiencing was based on a housing bubble that just exploded. The things that we thought we could afford, we actually couldn't. It was credit-fueled consumption, and we know what's happened to that. We know that we have to begin to start manufacturing things again, that we have to unleash our entrepreneurial spirit, that we have to connect that entrepreneurial spirit to the needs and the aspirations of the 21st century economy. As we think about that, something else is happening that we have to include, and that is our rapidly changing demographics. I want to show you a slide. And this slide actually looks at the changing demographics in this nation from 1980 to 2040. And what it will show you is that in 1980, about 20% of the population was of color. By 2040, over 50% will be. Can we see the slide? That's 2000. We missed 80 and 90, but you see how it's going. We don't need to go back. You get the sense. In 1980, 20% of the nation was of color, Native American, Asian American, Latino, African American. By 2040, 50% will be. Already, 46.5% of all children in this nation are of color. By the end of this decade, not 20 years from now, by the end of this decade, the majority of children in the nation will be children of color. In California, where you are now, 73% of all children under 18 are children of color. We are rapidly becoming a nation in which the majority of people will be people of color. As we think about our needs, having a strong middle class, and it's so important to have one. The middle class is what's made this nation. It's what's made our democracy, it's what's made our economy, it's what's made us stand out as a place that people aspire to in the world. You can pick any poor country, and what makes it poor is not the absence of rich people. What makes it poor is the absence of a middle class. These changing demographics and what happens to these children will determine whether or not we have a middle class. As we think about being competitive in the global economy, we know that we have to really invest in entrepreneurship and innovation. We know we have to have a workforce that's prepared for a 21st century economy. Whether or not this country is able to be the innovator, to be the producer, to be the driver that it's been around the world will depend on what happens to these children who are becoming the majority. By 2018, not a long time from now, by 2018, 45% of all jobs will require at least an associate's degree. By 2018, only 27% of African Americans, only 26% of Latinos, 26% of Latinos have it. It really sets up quite a challenge in terms of what we need to do on the education front. We know that we have real gaps between the well-being that we want for our children and where they are in terms of diabetes, in terms of obesity, in terms of so many issues that are related to health. We know that we need to be able to connect people to health services and job services and all kinds of things that our regions often have. And that for many people, the absence of a robust, accessible transportation system, public transportation, stops that from happening. And so when we think about what the equity agenda requires, healthy children, educated children, children who are connected to families that can provide all of the enrichment that they need, including an economic environment that allows them to be able to flourish, that the future is uncertain. It's possible for it to be very bright, but it is uncertain. If we don't change our ways and stop leaving so many children behind in rural communities, on reservations, in urban areas, in older declining suburbs, if we don't stop it, the future for this nation is not bright. And so this work of creating a society in which all can participate and prosper, in which all can have a real shot at fulfilling their full potential, which I call equity. This work of equity has become what you just heard, an economic imperative, an economic imperative. And as you think about the work of equity, there is nothing more important than education. You will lead the way. You will lead the way. There's nothing more important than education. And yet, I must say, I am discouraged every time I'm in a conversation with multiple groups of educators talking about the way forward. We just keep squabbling around the edges. We keep squabbling around the edges, digging deep into our position about it has to be this or it has to be that, without understanding that collectively we have the answers that we need. And if we could come together and recognize that we have those answers, including the role of making sure that all schools are community schools, we could be the champions for moving forward, not just on the education agenda, but on America's agenda. What we do with thank you. What we do through education will determine it all, and we know that education has to be beyond what happens in the classroom. I have heard the debate about whether we need to be just focused on what happens in the classroom or focused on what happens outside of the classroom and all the other activities that young children need. And what I always say is we don't have to debate that because we have had a long, long, long experiment. And that experiment has been what families with resources have been doing for their children for decades after decade after decade. And that experiment has said that we need the whole array of supports. We need to now make sure that low-income children and children of color can have that too. That has to be part of the agenda. As I said before, we're at a crossroads. The good news is there's no reason why this agenda that I'm talking about shouldn't get picked up by the American people, by our leaders, by our elected officials at all levels, because the diversity that is going to make up this nation is a gift. It is a gift. This nation keeps getting gifts. It just keeps getting gifts. Even when it doesn't deserve the gift, it gets the gift. When you think about the nations that are going to really be the leaders in the global economy, it's going to be the world nations. If you're a world nation, you really have a head start. Because if you're a world nation, you're connected to the globe through relatives, through language, through culture, through travel, through history. We are becoming a world nation in which there's no majority, in which everybody has somebody who they're connected to that's part of what the globe is about. What a gift it is. We just need to make sure that we invest in it. Coming back to entrepreneurship. Manuel Pastor, Stuart Quo, and I did a book. We actually did the book twice. The first time we called it Searching for Uncommon Common Ground, Race in America's Future. The second time we did it, we called it Uncommon Common Ground. I always like to joke that the search was over and we had found it. But in that book, one of the things that we highlighted is that you have 3 times the entrepreneurial activity in communities of color as you have in the white community. The communities of color are very entrepreneurial. They don't have the support, they don't have the access, they often don't have the connection to what the entrepreneurial needs are going to be in the future. But we need to take advantage of the diversity, of the spirit of entrepreneurship. We need to take advantage of all the knowledge we have about programs that work. There's a fabulous example, again, right here in California, PG&E, that's our energy company. It took a look around and it realized that two things were going on. They had baby boomers who were going to be retiring and they didn't have a skilled workforce to come into those jobs. And the nature of work had changed. They really needed to retrain a new workforce. What they did is they joined with their community colleges. Joined with their community colleges to start to train a new generation of young people connected to those jobs and make sure they would have the skills that are needed. The results of that program have just been amazing in terms of what's going on. We have other programs like the Promised Neighborhoods program that's really inspired by the Harlem Children's Zone, but getting away from this thing that everybody worried about. Did you need a Jeff Canada to do a Harlem Children's Zone? Well, you know, I've been on panels with Jeff when that question has been answered. And I always say that you need a truly, truly extraordinary leader to do it the first time, whatever the it might be. You need a leader to inspire people to go down a road that may be the end of a cliff. You need a leader who can convince people to give their money to something that is yet to be proven to be successful. You need an extraordinary leader to be able to transform people's thinking about what can happen. But once it's happened the first time, any old leader will do. Everybody has the capacity to be able to take that example of what's happened once and show it can happen again, and that's now happening through the Promised Neighborhoods program. You have work that you're doing. This room is full, and every one of you could stand up and give a testimonial about the transformational work that you're doing and that you're seeing. The good news is that we have a huge task in front of us to be able to prepare America's future for the America that we know awaits us. The good news is that we don't have to invent anything in order to rise to that challenge. We have everything we need. I always say local leaders are national leaders. They are solving the nation's problem. The problem that the nation has right now is how to take advantage of this pivotal moment, how to be able to connect the changing demographics to the needs of the nation, how to be able to develop policies that are infused with a commitment to make sure that every child has the ability, the conditions to reach his or her full potential. How to be able to really take this moment, push forward an equity movement, and create an America's tomorrow that we can all be proud of. I want to show you one little last clip, a PSA that PolicyLink had running on Times Square for about 6 weeks, just trying to depict the thing that I'm talking about now. If you could show it. Thank you. Let's all make America's tomorrow bright.
We're at a disadvantage up here. We couldn't really see that, but we'll get to see it another time. I want to make sure you all know that Angela wrote an amazing, amazing paper called America's Tomorrow, Equity is the Superior Growth Model. It is available on the PolicyLink website, and I would really encourage all of you to read it. I read it a couple weeks ago and really learned a lot, and it just got me more excited about having this opportunity to hear from you and to hear from our wonderful colleagues. So the game plan here is that we're going to have responses from our panel, and I'm going to introduce them right now. And then if I manage the time right, we'll have a little bit of time for you to ask questions, and there is a microphone up front, so I'll tell you when the time is right for that. But let me introduce our panel, and I'm going to start on my immediate left and introduce you to Francisco Guajardo, who is a professor of educational leadership at the University of Texas Pan Am, and he is also the executive director of the Llano Grande Center in South Texas. So you will be hearing from him, but I'm going to introduce the panel now, and then they're each going to make a few comments in response to Angela's wonderful remarks, and then we'll have a little bit of a conversation up here as well. To his immediate left is Junious Williams, and Junious is the CEO of the Urban Strategies Council in Oakland. And when you read Angela's bio in the program, you'll find out that she was the founder and initial director of the Urban Strategies Council. So Junious is standing on tall shoulders, but is doing a great job at that. To Junius's immediate left is Joann Weeks. Joann is the Associate Director of the Netter Center for Community Partnerships at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. And to her left is LaShawn Chatmon, who is the Executive Director of the National Equity Project, also based in Oakland. So what we have decided to do is to ask each of our panelists to give a 2 to 3 minute response to Angela's ideas and really helping us think about the role of school and community in moving an equity agenda across America. Francisco has asked to go last. Everything in community schools has to be negotiated all the time. Who would like to go first? Junious has agreed. Thank you.
Let me just say that it's not totally responsive to what Angela put out. We had some questions in advance. I want to do a couple things, make a couple points. One is around how central, I think, full-service community schools and promised neighborhoods are to the equity movement. And it's because of how foundational education is to equity. And you can talk about it in crass economic terms that we don't have a pipeline. We're failing kids of color, and as Angela illustrated in the PG&E example, we've got large gaps where we can't fill our current needs. So if we're going to talk about economic stimulation and talking about cradle to career and all of those sorts of things, it's really central that we get equity right in the schools, because it's going to fuel and fund almost everything else that we want to do with respect to equity. The second point that I would make is one around not overlooking what's happening when you're formulating full-service community schools around the constituencies. I mean, we're focused kind of internally on what happens in a full-service community school, but if you step back and analyze it, we've brought together families, young people, educators, service providers, in the best case businesses. We've gotten them all aligned around a vision and around moving an agenda and producing results. When I think about the situation in Oakland where we've made a commitment to a full-service community school district, what I see is 100 site councils of 10 or 20 people backed by a constituency within that school community. That's the workforce, the brigade for moving the equity agenda not only in the schools, but in all of the other systems that we need to move around making equity a constant within our society. And it's not mission drift to say that they're going to work on transportation because kids can't get where they need to go to take the resources that we have available. It has to do with economic opportunity and economic development. It has to do with everything, and what we have is a group of people who are already organized, who have learned how to work together to forge a common vision. We need to sic that workforce on the issues of equity to make sure that social services and healthcare and the business community and all of the other places where we need to make sure equity happens and happens right, we have the people to do that if we concentrate on those folks that are the core of leadership in the community schools.
So I think you're picking up on Angela's charge about the noise we make and the action we take. I thought that was really, really brilliant. So that you're picking up on that theme with the brigade and really the constituency to help move building a constituency to help move the agenda. Yeah. Thank you. So, my friends, Joann, would you like to go next and talk a little bit about maybe from the perspective of higher education and moving this agenda?
Sure, and as you, I guess, have guessed already from the program, I'm substituting for Ira Harkavy, the chair of the coalition and director of the Netter Center, who couldn't be with us this week. But I think what Ira might have started with is, I think, the increasing realization that higher education must be a part of this equity agenda and a partner with our schools if we are, as he always quotes, to realize the democratic promise of America for all its citizens, all of its young people, and that is a core mission of education. and one that we in higher education share. Higher education probably for the last 20 years has started to step up to its role in addressing, especially our urban universities, the fate of the communities around us, and recognize that the fate of our universities and the fate of our community are very much intertwined, that we and they are partners and need to collaborate in democratic, mutually beneficial ways to benefit our broader community and the way we think about our own teaching, research, scholarship. But through engagement, we are better institutions of higher education. And I think this theme has gotten picked up across the country by many of the colleagues in this room and elsewhere. In the community schools movement, we see a range of different types of engagement of higher eds. The Netter Center has really seen itself as a lead partner and permanent anchor for the work that we do. As we all know from past community schools iterations, without an anchor partner, this work can come and go, and that's what we've always tried to avoid. And higher education as a rooted institution, a place-based institution, can function as that anchor institution in these types of partnerships, along with our other community partners and our school leadership. And one of the things that we bring to the community schools, in addition to providing the support services, our medical institutions, our hospitals have stepped up, our nursing schools, dental schools, social work schools, to provide those types of resources into the schools. But as academic institutions, we have that natural alliance with K-12 education to help facilitate and develop better STEM education, improvements in literacy, opportunities for service learning, and our youth to be engaged in their own community as change agents. In our community, we do a major program in urban nutrition that engages from elementary through high schools. It brings in youth entrepreneurship, farmers markets, school-based gardens, a range of things where students learn, experience, and also are developing their leadership and skills for the future. And those are the kinds of extra resources, I think some of the connection to the academic work, universities and colleges. We see this really as not just a university, but community college, four-year colleges, and then the research universities. We all have a role in this. Just as a few other examples of this type of work, and many of these folks are in the room. IUPUI in Indianapolis has been with the George Washington Community Schools and the others that have been developed since day one as a facilitator of getting that school reorganized and as a core partner in developing that school and advancing the academic mission and bringing its students into that school, including their School of Education, working closely with their teachers. In Tulsa, the work has developed into a higher ed forum. 9 universities and colleges, including the community college, now have come together over the last 3 years on how they can support through academic partnerships the high schools in Tulsa. TAXI, as you all know, is the elementary program. It's robust, but we need to keep addressing what that next step is for our students. And they have come together in a mutual partnership with the high schools. The high school teacher can propose, I need help in chemistry. What can you do? A forensics teacher brings in from Tulsa Community College those resources, or students go back to OSU. So it's a wonderful kind of enriching learning experience that's mutual for both of us. Florida International University, which has been working with Jane and has worked with us, started last fall through first a planning grant from JPMorgan Chase and now a major implementation grant, a partnership with Northwestern High School in Liberty City, and they'll continue to work in the feeder pattern. But not only are they doing the community school piece, but they're also, as many other colleges are doing now, working on dual enrollment, where the students in that high school are in credit-bearing courses taught by college faculty that come into their high school. And these kinds of extra supports are happening around the country for our young people. There are many other examples. Seattle University is in the audience here, University of Toledo, which will be a lead partner in their city, University of New Mexico. And just to conclude, I think what I would like to say that we have come a ways in the 20 years. We still in higher education have a far piece to go, but the potential is there, and just a couple indicators of that. There's a major national organization of higher eds that are joined by the university's president to commit its university to service and service learning. They have some 1,200 institutions that are part of Campus Compact. Over 80% of them in their annual, they do an annual survey of all their members of the kinds of things the students are doing in the colleges. Over 80% of them are working in K-12 schools. That may be tutoring, it may be other things, but we have this rich potential if higher ed resources are organized and work in partnership to help with the community schools and moving that equity agenda forward. As you probably know, many higher eds are closely involved in the Promise Neighborhoods initiatives, the Choice Neighborhoods initiatives, as core partners, not simply as evaluators, as many of us, many people think that's the role of higher ed. You find a consultant out of a school of ed and hire them as evaluators, but that barely taps the potential for higher education. And then finally, I just want to touch on another aspect in higher education, and it is in Angela's report, the whole movement in higher education, recognizing our role as anchor institutions that, particularly in the urban areas, we are often the economic drivers in our communities. We're the largest employers. Penn is the largest private employer in Philadelphia, second in the state to Walmart, and that repeats itself across the country. If colleges do nothing else, they build buildings, they hire people, we buy lots and lots of stuff, and we have really, through this anchor institution task force that Ira is the chair of, and it's over 160 members now, really looking at much more systematically how universities on both their academic and also their corporate side, the business services, all those services and planning that goes on in a university to build buildings. How do we think about economic inclusion much more systematically and put in the right policies and goals so that the dollars that we're going to spend, and they're going to be spent regardless, have the best impact that they possibly can for our local community, including hiring and purchasing and developing local business to help to become suppliers to our institutions. So with that, I'll just conclude. We've come a ways, but we can go much farther.
So Joann, that was great, and you know, your description of the multiple roles that universities play in their communities and the tentacles reminds me of something that somebody was describing a community school director yesterday at the director's session and said, you know, the community school coordinator is like an octopus with the tentacles going in all different directions and a hand in everything. And I think that's what you're saying about the university as the anchor institution and so many opportunities to reach deeply into the community and to pull pieces together. So that's really helpful.
The last number of years, it's really becoming intentional about what you're going to do anyway. Yeah. And you know, for us to work in K-12 schools, that's a benefit for our students in multiple numbers of ways. We're going to build buildings, and probably if anyone on a higher ed campus, there's always a building going. Somebody's putting something up, renovating. You know, building in economic inclusion, goals for minority firms, women-owned firms, and as well as the labor force who does those things. Penn has gone to hiring in terms of the everything that we buy in terms of paper supplies in the university. The sole source contract is required to partner with a minority firm, build up their capacity for e-commerce so they can fill a Penn contract or a Drexel University contract in the future. It's that level of intentionality and thinking about equity within what you're going to do anyway.
Thank you. Thanks so much. So LaShawn, the time has come for me to ask you, since equity is your middle name, the middle name of your organization, the National Equity Project, we would love to hear your thoughts about how our work can move an equity agenda across America.
Sure, That's funny, Jane. I was about to say my middle name is actually Denise, but okay. Good afternoon, you all. It's funny, like I'm supposed to be sitting here, like I'm talking to them, but all of you all are listening, so I just wanted to make sure that you were still out there. I want to connect, before I answer your question, more specifically, Jane, to just a couple of comments that that were being made by Angela. And first is personal. Because my experience was probably the opposite of the one that, that Angela described for you, in that I actually probably needed, some of you, needed a community school in my neighborhood to have stayed there. But in fact, I am from South Central Los Angeles, and at the time that I was going through high school, our secondary schools were not safe. They weren't a lot of things. Safe was one of them. They also weren't high performing. And it wasn't a safe haven for young people who were in that neighborhood. And so my grandmother, who I was raised by, actually bused us to San Fernando Valley, right? So kind of on the opposite end of that, somebody out there from San Fernando Valley? Hey! So still, I benefited from a quality education, but it couldn't happen in my neighborhood. So I understand the value of being sure that wherever you are from, you have access to a quality education in your neighborhood. The second thing that I would connect to is that what I appreciate about Angela's framework and the framework that's being put forward by PolicyLink is that it's a conversation changer. It is, in fact, expanding how we are thinking about educational equity and who it's for and who it serves. And it's important, and I think it aligns with what others have said before. Kofi Annan, the Secretary General, thank you, said that on the foundation of education rests the cornerstone of freedom, democracy, and human development, right? So adding this notion of economics and the other kinds of benefits that you get from truly actually having educational equity in this country, I think it's time we figure out how to actually frame this conversation so that all of us fit in it. And so that this conversation about educational equity doesn't become code for actually just giving Black and brown students what they need. We actually have to understand and make a pitch in this country for the fact that we actually have a linked and shared fate. That what will happen to the least of us will happen to the greatest of us. And if we cannot figure out how to be in conversation around that, it will be to our peril. The National Equity Project believes, thank you. The National Equity Project believes that every child in America deserves the right to a quality education. And we coach people to become the leaders who deliver on that promise. Equity is at the center of our name because it actually is at the center of our work. We think about equity as the outcome that would be achieved, right? Racial equity in particular, that it would be the outcome that would be achieved if race, class, gender, sexual orientation no longer strongly correlated with how one fares. So here's another connection to what Angela was saying just a moment ago, that in a tight economy, in a time of changing demographics, in a time of incredible loss that this country has, that people in this country, families in this country has suffered, losing their homes, losing their jobs, that all of that fear has produced one of the most hostile policy environments we have seen in this country in probably 50 years. There is a reaction to all of these things that are actually making our jobs, your jobs, harder. We're a leadership development and coaching organization. And why? Because with all of the shame and the blame and the guilt and the finger pointing and the mandates, there is very little help for people who are trying to do this work. So we are a helping organization because we understand that actually people have to be able to be in positions, not just of leadership, they have to be able to take leadership, and they need to be supported to do the thing that has to get done. We have a social technology, a practice, that's focused on humanizing the oppressive and complex systems in which we work. Now, what do I mean about that? So part of what we have come to understand about community schools and community schools movement, and in fact, many of my staff are in schools and coaching schools and developing leaders who are running community schools. But we also understand that this is more, that your work is more than just the integration and delivery of services for children, that they're also part of your work is also coming to an understanding that your institutions themselves have often been structured to advantage some and disadvantage others. We have to figure out a way to be able to look at that work. So our work is focused on 3 things. Supporting people to heal from oppression. And why do I say that? Oh, thank you. Some applause for oppression. That doesn't right. Supporting people to heal from oppression. And why do we talk about that? Why do we think that that is important in the very work that you do? Because the distress, the distrust, the unhealthy situations that our school communities are in, that distress leads to uncaring and unthoughtful behavior. That uncaring and unthoughtful behavior leads to inequitable practices, policies, behaviors, and attitudes toward our children. So when we do our work, we actually support people to figure out what the connection is between race and culture and learning, to be able to create environments where children are seen as people who come with a whole set of skills, beauty, and knowledge. But issues of race and racism and classism, all of those issues, whether they are conscious or unconscious, we would argue that in our experience, it is not that there are malicious people out there trying to actually hurt children or cause harm or not educate them. But these issues have to be examined, have to be looked at, and people actually have to heal from some of the hurt that this has caused. Not just in the building, but in our communities. That part of what we know is as you all try and do your work and you try and build relationships with the community, there's hurt that has actually existed in that community from the lack of jobs, lack of education, lack of resource. And so as we go out and try and do our work, how we build bridges with those mothers and fathers and community members matters. So supporting people to heal from oppression becomes an important part of our work, building people's capacity to lead for equity. And we talk about leadership in a very simple way. We think that leadership means taking responsibility for what matters to you. So inside that definition, everybody can lead. And we, in fact, in our work with people at every level of the system, from superintendents to community leaders, people who are running the parent resource rooms, right? To be able to be aware of the intersections between race and culture and learning, to be able to assess, to actually use tools to be able to assess the degree to which your practices and your policies and the behaviors that are going on in your building are actually impeding or advancing equitable outcomes and practices for your young people and their families. And then finally, to be able to coach people to take bold action on behalf of children who are furthest away from opportunity. We feel like the change, and one of the significant things that we feel like we understand, so you'll note now that I am not going to tell you about the what, because you're doing the what, but we think that actually doing this work and reaching and kind of scaling equity, if you will, has to do with leaders understanding that what you do is important and that it's also insufficient. The what that you do, the technicals, the strategies, the policies, the strategic plans, the what, the technical solutions are insufficient. And that in community, to really achieve equity, how you do your work also matters, right? How you listen to your community about what matters to them inside and outside the building, how you invite people into the new intention, to a bigger, bolder vision about what's possible for their children, the way you communicate trust and transparency, and the way you build relationship across difference. That how we do this work together in the final analysis matters. We think that there's some promising things about scaling this work. I'm just back from Mississippi and I'll wrap up with this. But I think it's critical. I was just standing on the ground of the murder site of Cheney, Goodwin, and Schwarmer, right? This was decades and decades ago. The three civil rights leaders who were so brutally murdered in Philadelphia, Mississippi. And I was on a civil rights tour with a whole team of people who are fighting for quality early learning in the state of Mississippi. And we were there because they felt like it was important to understand the racial foundation under which their education system has been premised. They believed that if they did not actually do some healing, and if there was no reconciliation between blacks and whites in this community, and indeed across the state, that they will not be able to make progress. And it was tremendously instructive for me. And I was affirmed that this work at the end of the day, while we talk about systems and we talk about policies and we talk about practices, that at the end of the day, it's people who create change. And everywhere that anybody has ever called us to do, it is because the breakdown is between us. The breakdown is in relationship. The breakdown is because the mayor's office doesn't actually want to play with the superintendent's office. The breakdown becomes with the county health officer. The breakdown is relational. Oftentimes, that's the impediment to our work. And so being a leader for equity, we think, has to do with building capacity to work across difference. And I'll just leave you with a favorite quote, that leaders for equity, people who practice leading for equity must confront, disappoint, and dismantle, and at the same time, energize, inspire, and empower.
Thank you. Last but not least, our colleague from Texas.
Buenas tardes. Okay, primeramente le quiero mandar mis saludos a mi mamá, porque hoy mismo es Día de las Madres para las madrecitas mexicanas, y le quiero mandar estos saludos a mi mamá porque me va a ver por el video. So today is Mother's Day in Mexico, and so Mexican mothers in Mexico, but Mexican mothers in greater Mexico, which is how one noted anthropologist referred to that kind of diaspora of Mexican folks, in this country, but not only in this country, in Canada and in so many other places. And so in most of those homes, Mexican homes, those mothers celebrate Mother's Day today. Not on Sunday, but today. It's always el día 10 de mayo. And so, I had to apologize to my mother for not being there today. My mother lives in South Texas. And so I will pull up this video from the web, wherever it may be, and I will show my mother. So first I want to thank Angela for not only for her comments, but for her body of work. Not enough people tackle these kind of issues in the authentic way that she has done. She talks about issues of race. Not enough people talk about issues of race as a central kind of issue for how we build communities and how we build economies and how we raise children and how we build institutions such as schools. We're not talking about issues of race and the centrality of race in this entire discourse. She's doing it. I think we should all be doing it. But of course, we got to be skilled enough to be able to do that. She's skilled enough. How many of us are skilled enough to be able to do it? Because it takes a whole lot of nuance, and it takes a whole lot of understanding, not only of the human condition, but also the condition of this country. And so we are far from being at ease with that kind of conversation. And so I want to thank her for at least pushing us in her own, very gentle way. But really what I want to talk about is I want to talk about my mother. Because I happen to think that if we were to, in community schools, in anything we do, if we were to employ the model of our mothers, I think that our conversation on equity would be radically different. Because my mother is the greatest administrator of equity I know. When I was a little boy, and my mother used to call us into the house to come eat dinner, and there were only a certain number of tortillas, even though I do have a brother who would grab the last tortilla and put it under his armpit to claim it for himself, right? So that nobody else would get that tortilla. My mother knew how to ensure that every child would get the right number of tortillas. My mother understood how to practice equity in ways that nobody else could. My mother practiced the act of love like nobody else could. And you know what love is, right? Love is that great revolutionary kind of instinct and impulse and action. Who loves more than mothers? But when we run schools, do we remember the lessons of our mothers and how they loved us? To do instruction, to do assessment, to do anything else? I think that oftentimes we pay attention to other kinds of arguments rather than the most powerful argument of all, which is how our mothers raised us. My mother cared like nobody else could. And my mother wasn't about this aesthetic of caring, you know, where you treat the children sort of fairly. Or, no. My mother knew how to care for me, and she knew how to care for my brother Pepe, and for my brother Miguel, and for my brother Luis. And she knew how to care for the children in the neighborhood. My mother was so nuanced with her caring that she was able to understand the diversity of ways of knowing of the children. You know that? My mother was like a theorist in that way. Even though my mother never went to school a day in her life, she was not privy, you know, to this formal schooling process. She was from rural Mexico. You know, every once in a while, I think maybe 3 or 4 different times in her own childhood, a traveling teacher came to the rancho. But that's all it was. It was just a few days of schooling that she had. But she knew how to care. And she knew about, you know, these things called epistemologies, you know, systems of knowledge, and about ontologies, how children know. And she was able to administer that understanding through caring. I think that we often fool ourselves, you know, when we talk about issues of dealing children equitably by treating them like we believe, according to our own system of values. So we care in very artificial ways. That really undermines equity, it seems to me, if I remember my mother's lessons. But I think we should be about caring in culturally responsive, culturally appropriate ways, according to who the child is, who the family is, what the community is about. So my mother had it figured out. And I think part of why I was invited here was because I come from a rural place. And so I want to speak to that as well. You know, part of the argument that was made earlier was about how schools in urban places play such pivotal roles. Well, I think you know that schools in rural places play the only role, oftentimes. When the school shuts down in a rural place, the middle class leaves, the community will soon die. So this whole argument about consolidation of schools, especially in small communities and rural schools, is a devastating process. And we have seen in the chronicle of this country that when a small school shuts down in a small community, everybody leaves. The heart of the community is taken. And so I think that, you know, the rural dynamic, and I know that in Angela's report and in Angela's entire sort of discourse, not only here but in other places, she really pays attention to rural. But not enough people do. It is not at the center of the conversation. Even though 60 million people in this country live in rural areas, And rural people, we steward 85% of this land. And the only policy that really kind of governs what happens in rural places is the Farm Bill. That has nothing to do with community development in rural places. It has to do with subsidies. It has to do with other kinds of very corporate-driven values. So the rural conversation is actually on the margins of even this. And while certain people try to do something about it, it is not. It has not gained traction in the national discourse. So last thing that I want to say is this. I think that the fight for equity is actually not going to happen. I mean, we continue to see it in bits and pieces, right, in small islands, if we do not have an engaged citizenry. And I know that Angela talked about it. She talked about the noise. You know, and there may be noise happening with folks in this room, but is there noise outside of where you all live and where you all practice your own craft? I have seen in my 20 years now in public education, 22 years in public education as a teacher and now a college professor, a steady decline in an engaged citizenry, in young people. And I think this is very, I mean, we've seen this as a very sort of systematic erosion of children who are being encouraged and inspired to be engaged in communities. I think where we see it, we see good change, but in most places we don't see it. And it has a lot to do with the policies that we pass in this country that we have allowed to happen. I just want to honor my mother and my father.
Thank you for introducing us to your mother. I feel like I know her, and I'm sure she's proud of you. So I'm going to call her tonight and tell her what a great job you did. I'm conscious of the time.
You have to do it in Spanish because my mother doesn't know English. So,
okay, we'll work on that.
Make sure you do it.
In the interest of time, I'm not going to open this up to the audience, but I am going to allow Angela to have the last word.
Honored to have the last word after listening to all of you. I love the story about your mother, and I loved being reminded of exactly what we mean by equity and how it's not equal. It is so important never to confuse equity and equality, because in education is the best place to think about that. What we're not looking for is to make sure that all kids spend the same amount of time in school, use the same books, have teachers trained in the same way. What we need to do is ask, what do we want for all children, and then back into the discussion about what they need in order to get there. It needs to be geared toward the children, and I love you reminding us that we all know people who have done that superbly, and it often started at home. The race conversation is so important. My friend Manuel Pastor, who I mentioned earlier, always says we have to put race in front of us before we can put it behind us, and that is just so true. We don't have the skills, we don't have the language, we don't often have the fortitude to have that conversation, but when you start thinking about America's tomorrow and how our children have been so shaped by race, everything in this nation has been shaped by race, we have to have a way to understand the truth of this statement, that where you live in America is a proxy for opportunity. It determines whether or not you get to go to a good school, whether you live near a job, whether you live in a natural job network, if you happen to own a home, if there's any value in it. It even determines how long you live, and it definitely determines the quality of your life while you live. Understanding how race has played in to that sad reality, that where you live is a proxy for opportunity, is essential for achieving equity. I love the conversation about anchor institutions, and that you lifted up something that is so absent. So many anchor institutions are just so proud of what they do that they forget about all the opportunities to do what they do better if they paid more attention to the process along the way, that every dollar spent, every consultant employed, every decision made about where to put something is an equity opportunity. And of course, Junious reminds us that what we are doing in our communities, in our schools now, is the work that's needed. We know so much about how to go forward. It was my honor to be in dialogue with all of you. Thank you.
So, great. Thank you very much. Wow. So I'm sorry I didn't manage the time better, but so I cut into your recess. It's sort of like school in America, but I think we are better people for having spent this extra 15 minutes with this wonderful, wonderful group. So let's give it up one more time. Now, in the other duties as assigned to the moderator, I have a few announcements. So here we go. Don't forget to tweet about the conference, and it is hashtag CCSForum2012. You got that? Okay. Number 2 is make sure to mark the map outside. It's outside this room. Take a Post-it note and indicate where you are coming from. We know you are from 36 states and I think 100 cities. Number 3, we will be conducting video interviews in the hallway. Please share your story with our videographer. Number 4, the superintendents will be meeting at 10 a.m. tomorrow in the Walnut Room. The next announcement is the movie tonight is at 6:30 in Salon 9. And check your watches, the concurrent workshops begin at 2:15, so we're getting back on schedule. Thank you so much for your attention, and let's thank our panel one more time.